When you first started learning chess theory, you learn how to play the main line. That's all fine and dandy, but what happens if your opponent deviates? You can't just play a main line without considering the possibilities that comes with it. Do you want to play the Naudorf Sicilian? You better learn the Moscow, Alapin, Closed Sicilian, Grand Prix, and the Smith-Morra Sicilian as well. The goal is to learn the main lines, or at least the positional or tactical themes. Then find your own deviations where you can utilize the objective advantage of theory while taking your opponent into territory that you understand more. Here's one final thought. Not everyone plays to try to win all their games, but rather because they enjoy certain types of games. In other words, openings are typically stereotyped through their main lines, which means a person picking up an opening typically is attracted to the type of game they would get in the main line. For instance, when I play the Sicilian, I want to play something that I like. Now, before going into the lesson, let's begin with an introductory warm-up. Take a look at this diagram. Notice the two pawn structures. White doesn't have a pawn on the C file, and black doesn't have a pawn on the E file. So I can assume that a trade must have taken place on D5. Now let's add the pieces. What is black's knight doing on C7? And white's pawn on A3. So after the trade on D5, black played the knight to A6, planning to go to B4, but white stopped it by playing the pawn to A3. This is the opening line. D4, D5, knight F3, knight F6, C4, E6. Now remember the pawn structure. C takes D5, and now the C file is open. E takes D5. No pawn for white on the C file, no pawn for black on the E file, and after knight C3, C6. The game continued. And queen C2 stops the bishop from going to the F5 square. Knight A6 wanting to go to B4, and white stops that by playing the pawn to A3. Knight C7. Bishop G5 and G6. The plan for black here is to fianchetto the bishop on F8 by playing it to G7 and castle. Now take a look at this pawn structure. Notice that white plays the pawn to C3. Add the pieces to the board, and this is the position. What opening is this? This is the opening line. E4, E5, knight F3, knight C6, bishop B5, A6, and then bishop A4. And after knight F6, white will ignore the pawn on E4 and castle. You'll have to be ready for the possibility of knight takes E4. Black recognizes that his king is still in the center, and after attacking the bishop, black is prepared to castle. C3, allowing the bishop to retreat to the C2 square. D6. Now let's get to our lesson. First, I'm going to get you familiar with the pattern, the opening pattern. E4, C5. Possibilities after knight F3. White's second move. Knight C6 and followed by C3. White plans to play the D2 pawn to D4 at some point. So E4, C5. Knight F3. C3 is the move we're going to look at later. But for White's second move here is Knight F3, Knight C6, followed by C3. After Knight F6, White has two main options, and they are D4 and E5. E5 gains tempo. So the one we're going to look at now is the pawn to E5, gaining tempo in the center, and after Knight D5, White follows up with D4. C takes D, C takes D4, and now the development of the bishop. After D6, the other option for black here is pawn to E6. The one we're going to look at first is pawn to D6 and now bishop to C4. Knight B6, bishop B5. D takes E, knight takes E, bishop D7. Now after the trade on D4, in the last example, black played D6. In this example, the move is E6. And now bishop C4, D6. White castles, bishop E7, queen E2, black castles, rook D1. Now we're going to take a look at White's fourth move, option D4. E4, C5, knight F3, knight C6, C3, knight F6, and this time we're going to take a look at D4. What move does White play after Black captures the pawn on D4? C takes D4, the same move, pawn to E5 gaining tempo, and after knight D5, C takes D4. D6, bishop C4, knight B6, bishop B5. DE, knight takes E, bishop D7. This time White plays A4. And after E6, castle, bishop E7. And Black is ready to castle. One more example. After C3, knight F6, d4. This time, instead of taking the pawn on d4, black plays the move pawn to d5, and after e5, knight to e4, bishop d3, cd, cd4, and now bishop to f5. Castle, e6, bishop e3, bishop e7. Now let's examine positions after c3. Taking a look at the possibilities after e4, c5, c3. White's second move choice here. And black grabs the center with d5, and after ed, queen takes d5. White continues with development with knight f3 and knight c6, d4. White contests the center, e5, knight b to d2, ed, and bishop c4, queen d8, cd, cd, and castle. Bishop e7, knight e4, bishop e6, trade, rook e1, queen d5, and now knight on f to g5, e5. Queen f3, h6, in between move, queen h5 check, king to d7, queen h3 check, king c7, and knight e6 check.